Okay, so today we have a number of methods papers and they're all linked to the GLAS research group. That's the Global Language-Based Area Studies group. These are 4 of our PhD students who are at different stages of their PhD. And they are going to be giving some insights into some of the methods that they are using in doing a PhD. At the same time, you know, they're giving us advice, but we can also give our feedback on those methods and our experience of those methods as well. Now, before I go on and introduce the members of the panel, I should say that at the end of this session, you'll be given a questionnaire, which we're always grateful if you can fill in. Also, I'll mention that there will be 2 other sessions coming up fairly soon. One on the 21st of April, which is about Haitian women from Haiti, and it's a viewing of a film with the director of that film. It's called The Power of Haitian Women. And then there's another event on the 5th of May with Joey Whitfield, which is called The Prisoner Project, which will also 1:30 p.m. So that will be interesting. So today we're going to have 4 speakers, 2 of whom are speaking together. Our first speaker is Elena Barron-Himsworth, who'll be talking about interviewing. Our second is Katherine Williams, who's currently in Lawpool, the School of Law and Politics. And our third and fourth speakers are Eira Jepson and Elin Roberts, who are both working on Elin Arfon, sorry, who are both working on creative methods. So without further ado and without making any further mistakes, I'm going to introduce Elena to you. And Elena, you're going to talk on virtual encounters intervening in a digital world. And I will shut my microphone down.
Thank you, Gordon. Okay, let me start my presentation. Wait with me a second. Okay, so good afternoon and thank you for joining the event for the GLAS theme. Today, I am very grateful for the opportunity to present. As Gordon said, I am a PhD student at Cardiff University School of Modern Languages, and my research is on industrial relations, specifically the European social dialogue, which refers to the meetings between trade unions and employers at EU level to develop policies that affect European workers. My PhD is a qualitative study that focuses on the voice of national trade unions. And for data collection, I aim to conduct numerous interviews with trade union officials in the UK, Germany, and Spain. And my research is funded by the ESRC in collaboration with the Welsh DTP. Prior to the first lockdown this year, I went to Madrid in a short field trip to do an interview, which was meant to be my test interview as a way to practice ahead for the formal data collection for my thesis. And unfortunately, like it has happened to many with lockdowns, I had to reconsider the way my approach to interviewing. So as a relatively inexperienced researcher, this face-to-face interview experience was really important to make me feel at ease with the interviewing process. But at the same time, I realized that moving on to digital interviewing, that the interview would be slightly different. So although it may have been the most logical step, it comes with some reflections on how it might affect my data collection. So today I want to share some of these reflections and invite others to share their own experience and maybe questions that they might think are important around this method of work. So in switching face-to-face to online interviews, I realized that I was amongst the fortunate ones that could actually do this relatively easily, and that the change would not involve too much consideration, considering the participants in my interviews are all adults and they don't have particular restrictions when it comes to access to computers. However, that does not mean that there are no considerations in terms of methods. So it goes without saying that they're quite different to face-to-face. And this same event would have been quite different if we all had been in a room somewhere in the School of Modern Languages, maybe sharing a cup of coffee. So we all have had to adapt and learn this new digital reality. And in many ways, it has made our lives easier. I don't know if anybody here is actually joining from far away from Cardiff, but for many, it has opened up the possibility of meeting from places far away. So traditionally, telephone interviews and video calls have been regarded as plan B, with a clear predilection for face-to-face interviews. And of course, as a research student, this makes me wonder how digital interviewing might affect the quality of my work. And in fact, there are several studies that highlight the shortcomings of online interviewing compared to interactions in person. So as an example, we have Adams Hutchinson and Longhurst's study of 2016 that talk about the concept of affective atmospheres to explain how the place where we meet can help us to build rapport and make the interviewees feel more comfortable through things like shared sound and smell and tactile experience of the place that we're meeting in, and also the body language and the cues that we give through that face-to-face, especially eye contact. Conversely, Weller 2017 suggests that online settings may relieve what they call the pressure of presence. So it can make participants feel more at ease because they have a physical distance between themselves and the interviewer. So we can see that there are different approaches, different perspectives on this. And of course, with COVID, many of us have been forced to learn how to use online platforms quite quickly, which also impacts the quality of these virtual encounters as people become more accustomed to meeting online. In terms of structure, Johnson, Shettle, and Eklund, probably don't have those names right, 2019, say that there are no differences in the duration between online and in-person interviews, but the face-to-face encounters produce richer and more detailed data. Whilst other researchers like Crowell, Jolly, and Greenfield, also 2019, say that the difference between face-to-face is so modest that when you take into account time and budget constraints, it's perfectly reasonable to move on to video calls. So once you read all of these considerations in the literature and considering the restraints of COVID, digital interviewing seems more than enough, more than a reasonable enough adjustment considering the circumstances. And it has obvious advantages. It is time efficient. So when you say an interview is going to last an hour, it usually means 1 hour. You don't have to account for travel time and waiting time, all of these things. It's cost efficient. You don't spend as much time in travel costs or accommodation if you're going for a few days. And also, even the coffee that you have at home is going to be much cheaper than ones that you have in the cafe. And it's usually accessible and convenient. Even if you don't have a computer or a laptop to work on, most people have a smartphone that is capable of working with the apps that make these interviews possible. And of course, digital has also many challenges. There is the issue of poor connectivity. Not everywhere in the world there is the same speed of internet, and this can be a major issue both for researchers and participants. But also the digital skills, which can make this method inadequate if your target population doesn't have the necessary skills to work on these platforms. And although we're talking about virtual encounters, we also have the issue of that interviewing always requires a physical space from which to work from. And as most people will know from experience with COVID, this space is not always ideal. So we do our best, but distractions are sometimes inevitable. So in my research, I'm very fortunate to work with trade union officials who are working online and are now well accustomed to using video calls. But still, I have encountered these challenges, and sometimes internet quality just drops halfway through the interview. Sometimes there's an IT issue, and however good your IT skills, sometimes you can't solve that in time. I always have problems with this headset. I don't know why. Just as I have an event or an interview, I can't get my sound right. So from the 12 online interviews that I have conducted so far, I have learned that it is important to test the platform ahead of the interview and make sure to have a backup plan. Usually for me, that involves using my smartphone and having it ready and having perhaps another platform that you can switch to quite quickly if needed. in one of my interviews, I was having problems with sound, and when you have 1 hour to interview somebody, the last thing you want is to waste valuable minutes trying to solve IT problems. So I switched to my smartphone, which was charged and ready, but then it turned out to be a problem with Zoom. So we agreed to change to WhatsApp instead, which came with another problem, which is that WhatsApp doesn't have a record button. So I had to have my digital recorder ready so I could record that from the phone and speaker. So all of these things need to happen quite quickly so you don't miss on the opportunity. And also I try to plan for distractions as much as I can. Obviously, you can't plan for everything, but try to have the space that is quiet and private so you can conduct the interview. But we can't plan ahead for the distractions that the participants may have. So I had an interview where the participant had to step away to deal with their children for a bit. So if you can try to ask to make up for that lost time, that's a big thing, but it's not always possible. And also to not depend on the Wi-Fi, because I don't know if anybody else has one of these sort of gadgets that you plug onto your computer to get your internet. It's like a USB. But sometimes those can become faulty, and I had that problem and I missed an event because I couldn't get my Wi-Fi working. So it's always a good idea to hardwire your computer to the internet where you can. And when you're working on several platforms, it's a good idea to create a visual reminder, because it's very easy to lose track of the events that you have scheduled if you're not using just the one platform. With Zoom, it's a little bit different, because if you schedule your meetings, they all appear on a very tidy list, but that's not always the case with all the platforms. So, and finally, of course, to manage informed consent processes, which can be quite different from a face-to-face encounter where you bring your consent forms in person for them to sign. Sending the consent forms online and making sure that those are easy to follow and perhaps easy to sign via email is really important too. So since COVID, it is obvious that Zoom has become the preferable platform for many. You can see on this slide how the daily active users have increased during the pandemic, and its popularity is understandable considering the features that it offers, the ability to record the sessions, to manage the schedule, to engage participants with the chat, shared screen, even the poll feature. However, many of you may be aware of the early concerns about Zoom's privacy and security, which pushed many organizations to ban the use of Zoom amongst their members. So I thought important to mention this because despite the popularity of the app and the addition of end-to-end encryption, there are still many who will not engage in a Zoom meeting, and that can hinder your participant recruitment if you're only working with an app that has this sort of issues. And that I think it's one of the things to consider for researchers who are interviewing online, that you need to be aware of the security and privacy protocols of the platform that you're using. Face-to-face interviews, normally you would have your digital recorder, and later you would just transfer the interview to a password-protected computer at the university. But because digital platforms are intermediaries, we must ensure that they're reliable. And also, I'm not an IT professional, so all of this that I put on this slide, all the different technical specifications of security, sometimes sound really foreign to me. So as well as becoming familiar with the basics of online security, like encryption or authentication, we also can take certain steps to protect the data that we collect, like considering the difference between storing our recordings on the cloud or storing our files in the computer, protecting our files with passwords, or even applying our own encryption to the files where possible. And sometimes that can be, depending on the software that you're using, can be a little bit more tricky, but it's also an option for us to protect our files. And sorry. There are many apps out there to work with. So Skype, Google Meet, WhatsApp, Cisco WebEx, Microsoft Teams are some of the options. But personally, as part of my participant recruitment strategy, I have decided to give participants the freedom to choose the platform of their preference, which of course meant that I had to learn whichever platform they opted for. And that can be quite a challenge sometimes. And it has been a very interesting learning experience because each of these platforms has its own security and privacy system, different interface and features. Most of them will allow recordings, but like I mentioned before, WhatsApp is not one of them. So if you're switching to that very quickly, make sure you have your digital recorder to hand. And what I find the most interesting about these apps is the different features that they offer, which can really enhance the digital interview, like the chat, the whiteboard, or the poll function, like I mentioned before. For these extended features, I found that Google Meet, Microsoft Teams, and Zoom tend to work best. Google Meet offers a whiteboard or Jamboard, as they call it, that enables you to change the background. So you can have either lines or a nice square to draw a graph. And you can also have multiple pages, which can be quite convenient if you're working on different themes. In the case of my research, I work with organizations that have complex structures across different levels of policy making, EU, national, local. So when you're speaking to trade union officials, sometimes it's important to clarify the different levels within their own structures. And this can be a very helpful tool to create a map, which the interviewee can see at the same time as yourself and correct and even edit themselves if they feel comfortable. And this in Google Meet, you can download this as a PDF. And whiteboard seems to be quite a general feature. I don't think Skype has one, but Microsoft Whiteboards, for example, is a lot simpler. You can see the interface is more colorful, bigger buttons, all that sort of thing. So I don't know from my own experience, but I can imagine that it would be more intuitive if you're working with younger interview participants. And you download those as a PNG image. And with Zoom, you have the whiteboard is available for download on PDF and PNG. But what I find most interesting about Zoom is that you can use the poll, which you can prepare in advance with single and multiple choice questions. And it can be very helpful to clarify an interviewee's position in the last maybe 5 minutes at the end of the interview. When you're running out of time, there are certain questions that you want to clarify. And that can be a very helpful tool. And because these tools are integrated into the video call, it is much easier to bring them up without disrupting the flow of the interview too much. And internet-based research is not exactly new. So there are certain other things that you can use whilst you're working online. But certainly with the pandemic, we have been pushed to examine the true potential of these tools. And although it can be a steep learning process, it's also an opportunity to be more creative in our methods. And I know I'm very fortunate that my target population is, quite skilled in the use of these platforms. And I know it can be tricky for vulnerable groups or even children. But going back to Adams, Hutchinson and Longhart's concern about participants feeling comfortable with the online setting, I find that these technologies are continuously expanding and of course becoming more and more normalized. So it's only natural for this to have an effect in the ways we conduct research. And I find that as researchers, we have the responsibility to learn about the new processes and how they impact the data that we collect and our final results. So thank you for listening. Here are some references that you can check at your leisure once the video is uploaded. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Elena. That was really fascinating. And I think we'll do all the questions at the end. I forgot to tell people that you can send questions via the Q&A or via the chat. It's supposed to be via the Q&A, but I'll try to monitor both somehow or other. We can also ask questions. I see, Andrew, you've got your hand up already. Do you want to, if you're wanting to ask, you wanted to ask a question right away? I was going to do all the questions at the end, but I can, let me see, allow to talk. I'm allowing you to talk.
It's okay, I can ask at the end. I can briefly tell Elena what I wanted to ask, and then if she wants to reflect on it. Okay. I know she didn't cover it, but I know that any of us who've done interviewing in the past, one of the things that's the great burden of interviewing is the transcription. And I thought maybe she might want to comment on that, in just how time consuming it can be, and whether perhaps she's encountered any differences with in-person or kind of online encounters in terms of doing that. So happy to have that answered much later.
Okay, thanks, Elena. Hold your thought there, and thanks for that question, Andrew. That's a great question. Okay, so I'd like us, if possible, to move on to Katherine, and Katherine Williams, who's currently in politics and IR, and you're talking about conducting feminist research with anti-feminist subjects, I think, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. Hi, so I think I got cut off accidentally. I'll try again now. Sorry about this. Okay, can everyone see that? Okay, brilliant. So, hi everyone, thanks for tuning in this afternoon. I'm Kat, and I'm with the School of Law and Politics here at Cardiff University, and I wanted to reflect today about my experiences of conducting feminist research with anti-feminist subjects, and how researchers studying the far right can reconcile with the fact that they may be giving challenging voices a prominent platform. So I just want to start by giving you a bit of information about my project. So currently my provisional thesis title is Assessing the Role and Motivation of Women in the Alternative for Germany Party, which sadly at the moment isn't a hugely exciting title, but hopefully something will jump out towards the end. So in my research, I aim to unpack the role of women in the AFD, how they fit into party life, their political agency, and how this agency may be shaped by the ideology or the programmatic goals of the party itself. And just to give you a brief overview of my methods, I employ a feminist post-structuralist lens that casts a critical eye over the potential gender-based appeal of the party and how this may prove attractive to members. And I've constructed a case study with comparative elements that critically examines the issues that appeal to AFD members, and I use semi-structured interviews and documentary analysis in order to achieve this. And just a slight caveat here that since the pandemic, my project has undergone some significant structural changes. So I've now broadened my remit to include male voices. At the time that I conducted my fieldwork pre-pandemic, I only interviewed women, but I think it's safe to say that analysis of gender isn't restricted to women, and there's a lot of valuable discussion to be had in this context about masculinity, the party's seeming embrace of the men's rights movement, and the valorization of mythic strongmen by prominent members of the party. So I just want to touch upon ethics, which is really important, and the ethical implications of all of our research should require extensive critical reflection. And in a practical sense, in this context, this includes making a distinction between what Blee refers to as ethically permissible, i.e. what can be approved by ethics committees, and what is ethically right. And that involves assessing the potential impact of the project beyond researcher and participant. So in my case, I conceded early on, after writing a very ambitious research proposal, that I would have to focus on registered, i.e. legal parties, and that would be the most appropriate route for me. And I contacted my interviewees through official party or constituency channels, using publicly available information, and the party itself also distributed my interview request internally. So it goes without saying that research of this type presents researchers with many challenges. These can include the emotional impact of interviewing individuals whose worldviews are very different from researchers' own. to the professional implications of associating with what Fielding calls unlovable groups, individuals, or research topics. Sanders McDonough calls this academic dirty work, and in my own experience, there is a stigma attached to researching the far right, but I'd argue then that it's not only about how our research impacts us as researchers, whose voices do we prioritise, which groups are potentially affected by our entanglements with the far right. I argue in my thesis that researching the far right is an important field of inquiry, and while risk can never be entirely mitigated, critical reflection on our practices can help us navigate tricky epistemological terrain, and I use a feminist approach to help facilitate this, as I'll tell you about now. So if the goal of feminist research is largely emancipatory, i.e. giving members of underrepresented groups a voice, how can researchers studying the far right reconcile with giving individuals with anti-egalitarian views a potentially prominent platform? The practical and ethical dilemmas surrounding the selection of interviewees needs careful consideration. As Ackley points out, this is an act of epistemological power on our part as researchers. So a project like mine may inadvertently privilege the relatively powerful due to the nature of the research being undertaken and the research questions being asked. I suggest some strategies later on to mitigate this a bit. In my thesis, I seek to enrich understandings of how women engage in politics in this context. And while those I interviewed back in 2019 didn't identify as feminist, they are what Schreiber calls gender-conscious political actors, as they collectivise on behalf of like-minded others on issues central to their personal and political worldview. So this approach is beneficial in three ways. It centres women in particular as research subjects in their own right, in contrast to studies which have historically been dominated by images of white working class men, and this still remains an important avenue of study. Gender is used to interrogate dominant discourses surrounding political subjectivity and subjects' engagement with ideology and discourse. And it recognises that research subjects are important political actors whose engagement with the social world has broader implications, as contemporary political events have shown. Brexit, the election of Trump, the election of the AfD to the Bundestag, women formed quite a significant part of these supporter bases. So I ask in my research, why do women join the AfD? To what extent do issues relating to gender play a role in their recruitment? Is this the same for male peers? What does the party offer members that the other mainstream parties can't? Which issues are most important to those joining the party? How do subjects reconcile party politics with their own lives and experiences? So, moving on to in the field, there's no unique feminist method, as Tickner points out, and there are many different types of feminism. But the methods most associated with feminist research, such as interviewing, can help us develop meaningful narratives regarding subjects' engagement with the AFD in this context. So what does this look like in practice? In 2019, I spent 2 months in the field conducting semi-structured interviews with registered AFD members across 3 German states. Interviewees were both elected representatives of the parties, MPs, or rank and file members. All were women, and I typically use 3 types of questions to engage my interviewees, and they are icebreaker questions, essential questions which I wanted all interviewees to answer, and then some potentially problematic questions, and I'll give you some examples in the next slide. And here's a picture of me outside the Reichstag on the day of my first ever research interview. And shortly after I took that picture, I got absolutely drenched in a downpour and went to my interview looking a bit sodden. So it doesn't matter how much you prepare, sometimes things can go wrong. Okay, so some examples of questions. So to begin, I asked each participant a set of icebreakers. So this is quite general stuff. What interested you in the AfD, and were you politically active before joining the party? Following on from this, I'd ask slightly more in-depth questions. What are the most important issues facing women in Germany today? Do you think Germany has a humanitarian responsibility to accept refugees? And what does it mean to be German? And if those questions weren't loaded enough, depending on how the interview went, I'd asked some potentially problematic questions, and I would try to kind of keep up to date with party life, as it were, various controversies that emerged during my time in Germany. So, for example, when I got to Germany in October 2019, a member of the Bundestag called the AfD the political arm of right-wing terrorism. And I asked interviewees how they felt about that, how they felt about being called extremist or populist, and is that fair? And I also asked them questions such as, what do you think about members of the party who aren't in traditional heteronormative relationships? And these questions were designed to elicit thoughtful responses from interviewees, helping to shed light on where they situated themselves in dominant social, cultural and political discourse. And it also gave me an idea of how their political identity developed over time and space, and the contextual factors that underpinned their support for the party, despite the many contradictions that arose. In my thesis, I explore three main themes that emerged from interviews in greater depth. So these are Islam, gender and national identity. So writing about reflexivity and positionality are one thing, but in practice, this can be quite difficult, particularly if your interviewees express opinions that challenge your own worldview. I'm going to give a few examples now. All the interviewees have been given pseudonyms. So, for example, in an interview with Gisela, we were talking about LGBTQ plus representation in the party, and anyone familiar with the party knows that they have several high-profile LGBTQ plus members. So I asked her, would you say that the AfD accepts diversity? And she says, there are two terms, there is acceptance and there is tolerance. In a conversation with Gabi, I asked her about Germany's humanitarian responsibilities to accept refugees, and she simply answers no, she doesn't think that Germany has a humanitarian responsibility to accept refugees. In conversation with Dagmar, I ask what are the biggest problems for women in Germany today, and she says new feminism and gender politics. And lastly, in a conversation with Elsa, she was bemoaning the fact that the left-wing opponents of the party seemed to be tolerated by the media and political establishment, and how that wasn't fair because they weren't facing observation from the security services. And she says that the so-called Antifa, it's just a left-wing terror scene, but they are called activists in the press. These terrorists are called activists. So this just gives you an idea of the type of viewpoints that were emerging from interviewees. And I guess they might not be the most scandalous viewpoints we might come to expect from the far right, but I think it really gives us an example of the lack of empathy that some interviewees had towards other groups. So I just want to finish up by suggesting some strategies about how we can critically engage and reflect on our own practices. So the first one, expressing your own opinion in interviews, yes or no. I was often asked my thoughts on different topics and I felt comfortable responding to them. MPs are used to scrutiny, but ordinary party members might not be. You're discussing their personal experiences, and I think a bit of give and take is necessary depending on the context and whether you feel comfortable, whether the researcher would feel comfortable doing that. And I recognise my own privilege here as a white cisgender person. A person of colour or someone from a different background might have had a very different experience asking the same questions, and was actually very surprised at how open some of my interviewees were. So accurate reporting, the second point. So we have a responsibility to accurately report subjects' accounts, even if they don't make sense. But discerning the innate truthfulness of this account shouldn't be the primary goal. A feminist approach recognises that knowledge itself is historically contingent. Okay, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing our homework on broader empirical claims made by interviewees. So we should engage in fact checking. Where are they getting their statistics from, and which authors are they citing? So, for example, in a conversation with Dagmar, she mentioned a book which apparently proves the AfD's theories about rising birth rates or declining birth rates in Germany. So she gave the name of the person, the year that the book was published. So I thought I better look into this. Apparently it was the top of Der Spiegel's bestseller list of this particular year. I go to the Der Spiegel online archive, can't find a hint of this book anywhere. So then I liaise with a senior colleague in Germany, and they have a look as well and come to the same conclusion that this book doesn't exist. There are other books, but not this book. So we have a responsibility to make sure that we're not just taking these broader empirical claims at face value. It's really important to reach out to others working on similar topics, and I met up with PhD candidates and researchers from anti-racist organizations when I was away, the Amadou Antonio Stiftung and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, who are very generous with their time and resources. And some organizations working with vulnerable groups don't collaborate with researchers off the cuff. For example, Exit Germany, which is a big anti-extremism charity, but they can be supported in other ways. Sometimes they have public events. And when I went away, I went to a photography exhibition, for example, which was detailing some of their work. And lastly, self-care goes without saying. And if you're away conducting fieldwork overseas, sometimes that can be quite difficult to strike a good balance. But I tried to relax and enjoy my time there as much as possible and eat lots of delicious German treats such as Eierschecke and drink lots of nice coffee and just enjoy being in a new place. Thanks for listening.
Right, thanks very much, Kat. That was absolutely fascinating. And I think we're going to go straight on to our next speaker because we want to have a mop-up session of a whole series of questions at the end. So we've got two speakers. We've got Eira Jepson and Elin Arfon speaking, I believe, still on creative methods, and who are doing a joint presentation. So I'll let you work out the order in which you do that, and I will mute myself.
Brilliant, thank you, Gordon. Before I share my screen with our presentation, I'm just going to send you all a link. There's no need to open it now, but just before I forget to actually send that. Right, let me share my screen. Okay, can anyone just give me a thumbs up that you can all see that yet? Fab, diolch. Okay. Yeah, so Eira and I will be discussing creative research methods today. So as Gordon said, I'm Elin, and I'm a second year PhD student here at the School of Modern Languages at Cardiff, and my PhD is looking at multilingual education across secondary schools in Wales. And then Eira.
And my name's Eira. I am a third year PhD student at the School of Modern Languages, and my research looks at pupil motivation to learn languages in schools in Wales, and specifically the influence of outreach projects on that. So a sort of similar and complementary topic to Elin's, which is why we're presenting together today. And I think we both work in this sort of education sector, which is where the creative research methods kind of the use of those really came to complement our work. So just to cover what we're going to talk about today, diolch Elin. We'll give a sort of introduction to creative methods, but our interpretation of that, specifically the use of visual narratives. I know it's a very broad topic, so yeah, we don't claim to know everything. And then we'll provide examples from our own work. This is largely pre-COVID, and maybe we can have a discussion at the end, and we might trial some ideas for doing this in a virtual world as part of an online activity. And then, yeah, and then we'll have some questions at the end. So what are creative methods, or what specifically are visual narratives? So as I say, it's a very broad topic. There's lots of different types of creative methods. I'm sure lots of you use different types, but they're used commonly in the field of language learning specifically. as Suarez et al. Sort of explain here, because they enable participants to maybe talk about some quite complex ideas that may be difficult to express in speech. That might be sort of feelings or things that they embody. And specifically, as I say, we're going to discuss the use of visual narratives for doing this today. And they tend to be used either as an alternative or as part of more traditional data collection processes. So as part of a focus group or as part of an interview, some sort of visual narrative technique may be used. And quite simply, these are sort of methodologies that allow participants to draw or create visual representations of what they want to say. So of their experiences or their perceptions or their feelings. And these visual representations can then either be used as data in themselves or as a means of facilitating further discussion, or ideally a combination of the two. So as I say, there are a number of benefits to these. It provides an opportunity to reflect, as I say, on often more complex like concepts or experiences or emotions that can be difficult to describe. And to do this through creative production, which a number of people quite enjoy. As I say, we both work in sort of the field of education, and these techniques are commonly used with children who find it even more difficult maybe than adults to express themselves or to describe their experiences. So they're often used with those sort of groups. Sorry, my notes are on my screen, but the presentation keeps going full screen, so I keep losing them. Bear with me. So they're often used with children, and then something that might be interesting for this group is that they can be, they don't have to be language based, so they can often transcend any language barriers that exist between you and your participants, which can be quite important in certain settings. Now, as I say, there's no prescriptive way of using visual narratives. There's lots of different versions. And it depends on the suitability to your research. As I say, we both work with children, so that's why it became suitable, but also the suitability to the types of research questions you're asking and things like that. And there are downsides to them. They can be quite time consuming, they're often quite resource heavy, and in particular at the moment they can be harder to carry out online. But we've both found them very useful tools for what we're trying to achieve through our PhD topics, especially when we start discussing emotional ideas or ideas of identity, multilingualism, things like that during a learning process with our participants. So an example from my own work. So as part of my PhD, I have used... Sorry,
Eira. Can I just say something is happening to my computer? Can you at all possibly share your computer? I think I'm going to have to go off the Zoom and come back in.
Yeah, of course.
I'll be very quick. I'm going to try and sort this out. Sorry for that.
Right.
Oh, no, it's charging. I'm so sorry for having to stop. Right, you can carry on. I think it might work. Sorry about that.
No problem. Just let me know if you need me to start sharing. So as I say, as part of my PhD, I have used what I've called a mapping technique in focus groups, and specifically this is with university age learners, to try and build a picture of sort of their language journey and what has motivated their language journey. And the reason I've done this is because these students, these university students, were visiting schools as part of an outreach project and were asked as part of that to share their experiences and to try and encourage pupils in schools to learn languages. So I wanted to know what these experiences were that they were going to share, you know, what they'd enjoyed about their language journeys, what had motivated them to learn. But that's a very broad question, you know, what has motivated you to learn languages? If I were to ask any one of you that now, you'd probably go, where do I start? And so, well, and then on the other hand, I didn't want to ask questions that were too leading as well. I didn't want to start saying, how has X motivated you, or how has Y motivated you? Because then I'm already sort of structuring their answers too much. So this technique helped me, or gave my participants a chance to reflect on that question and organise their thoughts before they had to sort of start explaining them to me. And it also gave them a chance to acknowledge all these different things that had influenced their journey, and then let me focus the discussion later on by pinpointing certain aspects of that. And that avoided too much sort of jumping around when we were discussing later on or backtracking. I often find in interviews where I don't use any sort of complementary technique like this, often I can ask a question and someone will give me one answer and then go, oh, but I forgot to say this and I forgot to say this. And it actually avoided that sort of thing happening. So I know this is probably quite small, but you may be able to see several layers on this map. So you've got initially kind of the drawing that the student gave of the different stages of their language journey, the different places that were relevant, the different people. But then on top of that is also a layer of post-its, which provided an explanation for how those different stages or those different places or people had influenced their journey. And we have yellow post-its for positive influences, pink for negative. And already from those two aspects, you know, for me, there's sort of, it's visually quite striking. I can sort of see here that this student has drawn a lot of different flags, far more flags than the languages she studies at university. So already we can see the influence of different languages coming in here, not just what she's studying. I can also see that there's almost a yellow and pink post-it for every different section. So there's not one thing that was had a positive influence and one thing that had a negative influence. Actually, along a language journey, people are juggling a lot of different influences, both positive and negative. And if you could see in detail more, you can start sort of reading the explanations on the different post-its, and I can start comparing different stages quite easily and seeing where sort of changes really started happening and the sort of dynamic nature of the journey. And the final layer that you might not be able to tell from this photo is that there's a number 1, 2, and 3. So at the end of them creating this, I asked them to choose what they felt were the biggest influences on them. So they'd had time to reflect, and then they could choose the biggest influences, and we used that to focus our discussion. And then it was done on their choices and their priorities, and not me using leading questions. So what did I learn from doing this? Well, adults really enjoy creative methods too. Actually, none of the students that I did this with didn't enjoy this process, and lots of them kind of asked me for more colours, felt tips, more post-its, everything. And the feedback after the focus groups were that they really benefited from that activity at the start. I do think it's important to have a discussion, both either during or afterwards, because I think it's probably very easy to jump to conclusions around what this data says unless you've also discussed it with them, the participant. But as I say, it helps them organise their thoughts, and then you get some very rich explanations as to what they've put down. I did start just before lockdown using this technique then with pupils in schools as well, but unfortunately that was curtailed and probably won't end up featuring in my PhD research. But from that experience, actually, certain age of pupils that I was working with, sort of teenagers, didn't enjoy this as much as adults. They got a bit of stage fright. And so we used it more as a facilitation of discussion, where they would start drawing some things and then we'd start discussing them as they were going along, than creating this kind of rich piece of data, which I tended to get from older learners. But I didn't conduct enough of them with younger learners to know if that was a trend or just happened to be sort of a result of the situation we were in. So that's my example. I will pass over to Elin so she can talk through some of what she's done.
Thank you, Eira. I do apologise for cutting across there. Technology is great until it doesn't work. So, right, I'll talk a bit about my methods now then. and hopefully I'll be able to stay on the actual Zoom. Right, so as Eira's mentioned, she's been working with mapping techniques. However, for my master's thesis, which I did in summer 2019, I actually used emojis and timeline interviewing techniques. And these are the methods I'm actually going to concentrate on today. So for my master's research, I hosted focus groups with secondary school students who speak home and community languages. And this was in a secondary school in Wales. And we were discussing their language learning and discussing also language assessment and qualifications at the secondary school level. So what is a language timeline then, or timeline interviewing? Well, I drew inspiration from Sheridan et al.'s narrative-based research that used timelining as a form of graphic elicitation in interview settings in health research, interestingly. And what I saw in Sheridan et al.'s research was that this method of timelining could be used to discuss complex and dynamic situations. And I saw an opportunity here to adapt this to look at students' language journeys instead of health journeys, as opposed to the other research. Now, as Sheridan et al. Mention in their work, timelines enables us to draw a visual representation of different points in our lives, can be used as elicitation tools for further discussion, or can in fact be analysed themselves as visual data. And participants, of course, can become researchers of their own lives. I particularly liked that point. So what may such timelines look like? Well, I'm going to give you an example, as you can see on the PowerPoint. So if you look to the left then, you can see my own language timeline. I drew for each of my languages actually separately and in terms of life stages. So I had early years, school, higher education, and you can see that a lot of it actually was written in Welsh and in English. Now, if you look now to the right, a participant of mine actually drew their languages all on the same timeline. So you may notice also in these examples that there is, more information than strictly languages and then a timeline. There are comments there relating to attitudes and certain times or reasons for changes in the use of language. And what I did was to use these timelines then myself, was to use them as an elicitation tool to discuss students' views of their languages and then ask questions based on how they drew their timelines, yeah? And some of the themes that we actually had then was this big theme really of mobility. So we had temporal mobility, spatial mobility, and then mobility challenges as well. And this all came from the students actually just discussing what was on the timeline. And then a few points then as well as to this terminology that they were all using to discuss their languages. Again, very interesting, but I won't go into that today as I'm specifically discussing the methods. So that's a general idea of a language timeline or timeline interviewing. And Sheridan et al.'s, what's it called, a paper, their article is very interesting there if you want to take a look. Now, another thing I did then, and I absolutely love this, is to use emojis, quite simply. So why did I use them? Well, after using the timelines as elicitation tools during these focus groups, I realized that some students were actually still very shy and they were very quiet, not really contributing. Now, coincidentally, I brought with me lots of A4 sheets of emojis. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with them, but I brought a lot of arts and crafts stuff with me, to be honest, just in case some of the creative methods, wouldn't actually work. And then towards the end of the first focus group I held, now being mindful that some students were still rather quiet, as I've said, I made a last minute decision actually to give each student an A-sheet paper of different emojis. So I think we had about 50 different emojis. And then I asked the students to circle the emojis that best represented their attitudes towards a given topic. And at the time, we were looking at language qualifications, at being able or not being able to do those qualifications. Now, for me, this was a great way to enable students, especially shy students, to express their feelings without having to rely exclusively on oral discussion. And I'm just going to give you an example here. So some students in the research, emojis to describe how they felt about not being able to do a qualification in their home or community language, if this was the case, of course. So we had the sad emoji, for example, as you can see, or the heartbroken emoji. And students used such emojis to then express comments such as a bit disappointed, unfair, sad, shocked, not really happy about it. Yeah, so all those emojis that you can see at the top there. And then when I asked students about, well, those students who were actually able to complete then a qualification in a home language or community languages, you know, emojis such as the sunglasses emojis were actually chosen, or the, you know, clapping hands emojis. And, you know, and these then used to describe comments such as appreciation, happy, it's good that I had the opportunity. And I think what I've really learned about using emojis and the timelines really is that there is a, you know, crucial ethical dimension here. As not all of my students or all of the participants had English as a first language, or they were classified as students who had English as an additional language. Therefore, I think here, you know, I ensured I was demonstrating cultural sensitivity, as it is conceptualized in the literature, during the design and implementation of selected methods, in being mindful of the different relationships that these participants may actually have with those different languages, because they were obviously multilingual. Therefore, for me, I think the importance here of creative methods is to be able to, you know, enable students to express themselves through a very different way than asking them to express themselves orally all the time. And I think that's, you know, that's something that we perhaps could discuss in a discussion later, is that idea of a different way of expressing ourselves. Now, in terms of these emojis, I thought we could do something very, very quickly. So if you go on the chat, that link should still be there, and you should be able to hopefully press that link. And then there's an actual code that I've added. Is that possible? Can you actually go on that link? And then the code is just underneath, yeah, 21002956. So that will take you to mentimeter.com. And then what I want you to do is comment on the question with the emojis that best represent your views. So now if the technology works here, hopefully it should come up. Yeah, so this is the question. So when you were in secondary school, what did you think about language learning? Very simple question here. It's just an example of how you could do this in an interview setting. And please just use emojis only. That's the only thing I need. 1 or 2 emojis, that's it. Hopefully it should work. I'll check on my other screen. Right, I can see them coming up on my other screen. Ah, good point, Kat. Okay, so okay, Catherine's just commented that it won't let you comment because you haven't got an account. Again, okay, fab. For next time, I know it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Okay, let me stop sharing my screen quickly then and change my screen so you can see the online version then. Right, so you should all be able to see this then. Right, and as you can see, we have all those different emojis, and you know, if we had time, we could then have a discussion. Okay, why did you select the world emoji or the sleeping emoji? And it's just a good, easy way really to have that discussion. So just to finish off, let's go back to the PowerPoint. Brilliant. Okay. Right. And just before we finish, I'd just like to note actually another thing is, of course, you can use other online tools. As obviously we are now navigating our ways through this online world. And for example, I really like Padlet, and it can be used, in my opinion, as an online version of a language timeline. So of course, we don't have time today to complete this activity, but you can see actually, if you were to do an activity like this, you could have students inserting their comments under each section, yeah, and then they would be able to create a timeline collaboratively or separately, depending on what you want. So I think, you know, all these online methods are great as potentially interview methods. We haven't used them, Eira and I, because we've been doing the face-to-face. Well, we've been in the face-to-face context, but also these can also be used, I think, fabulously as learning tools as well in the classroom. So I'm going to finish there today. Diolch yn fawr iawn, thank you. And I do apologise again for the technical issues there. And Eira, I think you have some few concluding remarks now.
Yeah, so just to conclude, I just wanted to say that, or reiterate the fact that, you know, the examples we've given today have very much been shaped by our own research aims, our own research questions. So, you know, they may not be appropriate for other situations, but we wanted, but in general, we've found that they help us, or they've helped us generate very interesting discussions with participants and very rich data as a consequence. So we wanted to end with some questions for you, really. I mean, we're more than happy to answer any questions you've got on what we've done, but we're interested in what are the creative methods people have been using and how they've found them, specifically online, because that has been a sort of hurdle for both of us, but made more difficult by the fact that schools are still closed. So whether we could use online techniques or not, we can't access those participants at the moment anyway. And then also what, you know, what benefits and what problems people see with using these types of methods. So diolch yn fawr iawn, thank you. And yeah.
Okay, so that's perfect. Thanks very much. So thank you to all the speakers. Absolutely high quality, top-notch methodological talks, for which I am very grateful. Now, I know that people don't generally write in the chat and in the Q&A, other than to give me instructions, for which I'm grateful. But please do, or please ask for your hand to come up, and I can ask some questions as well. But in the meantime, I think Elena will let you take the question that's been asked of you. But please do not be shy. Please do put a question in the Q&A or in the chat. I can monitor both. Elena?
Thank you, Gordon. Yes, in answer to Andrew's question about transcription, yes, you're quite right that this is something that, you know, if technology could give us, make our lives easier in terms of transcription, that would be fantastic. I personally don't think that we're just there yet, but we're close. The reason I say this is because I don't know if anybody else has used subtitling in video calling, but it can be sometimes really funny to see what the subtitles say you're saying and misunderstanding. So speed and clarity when we speak is crucial for the computers to understand, and they haven't grasped all the accents and all the languages. So I think it will be interesting to see what happens in the future, but Zoom has now enabled transcription, I think, of the videos that are stored in the cloud with them. I haven't been able to try this feature because it wasn't available on my Zoom. I don't know if you have to have a paid version or some sort of license, but I know it's something that is happening. The only thing is it's only available in English, and because I haven't tested it, I don't know how well it works. But what I have used to facilitate my own transcription process is to play the recording to words dictate, and it will come up with hilarious transcription. Sometimes it's really wrong. I can give you an example because I say the word sectoral all the time, and Word seems to think that I'm saying sexual. So that's really wrong, complete different context. So no, that's not what I want. So it's helpful in the sense that it can give you a very quick transcription of what the computer is understanding, but of course, then you have to take the time to correct the mistakes that the computer makes in understanding some of those words. But yeah, there are certain tools out there that can definitely help.
Thanks, Elena. I mean, I'm reminded of there's a sketch on the internet with two Scottish guys in a lift, and they're speaking to say which floor they're trying to get to, and the lift, of course, can never understand them. So they're stuck in the lift for hours. So I think there's a similar problem there. Now, we've got a really good question from Rachel, which I'm voting up because it is the only question as well, but it's also a really good one. So I'll read it out. It's for everyone. Thanks all for your excellent papers. I have a question for all the speakers, stroke anyone who wants to respond. How have you dealt with access to your participants when collecting data during COVID? Have you found that economic situations have led to issues in interview subjects being able to participate and you accessing them as respondents? Who wants to go at answering that? And Joey's also asked a question, which I will
I'm going to say very quickly, in my case, my answer is no, I haven't found any issues, and it's precisely because my target's participant population is not unused to working online, so it's actually been surprisingly easy to contact them via email or even through LinkedIn, and to get those contacts, and also very, very open in terms of the giving contacting with other people, so CCing someone on the email in case they're interested. So the snowballing process was a lot easier than I found in my face-to-face experiences.
Anybody else? Yes.
Yeah. For me, it's been really difficult. So last year I made an amendment to my ethical approval to conduct Zoom interviews, and sent out a big request, emailed all the regional officers of the party, the main party press office, etc., and plus contacts before who were really helpful, and there was no response, or if I did get a response, it was quite snarky. So the people and the party weren't willing to cooperate as much as they were before. And I think there's some discussion to be had in my case about participants' fear of surveillance. So you can reassure someone as much as you can that the data that you get from an online interview isn't going to be used in any nefarious way. But I think, yeah, that fear of surveillance might discourage party members from taking part in interviews. And now the AFD are actually being monitored by the German security services for right-wing extremism. So that I think makes things a lot more difficult. And I don't know how that will pan out for me in terms of more interviewees in the future.
Either of Elin or Eira, or both?
I was just going to say that by now I've had to sort of cancel all my work with schools because they're currently closed, and by the time they reopen, the pressures on them in terms of other things will just be far too high. But before Christmas, when I was still trying to make that work, there were obviously quite big ethical and safeguarding issues to or concerns to consider in terms of working with pupils online. But actually, luckily, the Welsh Government had provided schools with quite clear guidance on this. So both Elin and I think I'm right in saying, felt we could sort of follow that guidance, and that meant that we had to use certain softwares. A certain number of adults needed to be in the room, but actually that never happened because obviously the situation got worse again. But also I found it quite interesting that of the schools I was working with, some were open to that and some had blanket school policies, especially in more deprived areas. You mentioned sort of economic factors there. So especially in the more deprived areas, some of the schools had blanket policies where they didn't operate online with pupils in Zoom or Teams calls or anything because they knew that there were access problems. So then that had a knock-on effect to my research. So some of the schools said from the off, we wouldn't be able to run focus groups. So I think had that happened for me, I would have had some sort of a bias in terms of the types of schools I was working with, and probably the age of pupils as well, in terms of who I eventually talked to. But Elin, I don't know if you've got different experience.
Yeah, I'll just briefly add that I'm working a lot with education stakeholders in Wales and also, of course, with specific schools. And what I found interviewing people who are, I guess, in the realm of government is actually, it's been much easier. Because as Elena said before, when I'm asking for an hour, I'm literally just asking for an hour. There's no need to book a room in the building. There's nothing like that. So actually it's been much easier, I think. But in terms of the school, as Eira said, very difficult. And even though interesting from a Cardiff University perspective, ethical approval, you know, has been granted for this online dimension of being able to host focus groups or interviews online. From a school perspective, that's just not always the case. And actually, if I'm being honest, that's hardly ever the case because of this idea of online safety and online safeguarding as well. So at the moment, I haven't been into schools either. And I'm actually not sure if I'll be able to carry out those focus groups at all with students. So we'll have to see. So it's, yeah, it's been interesting in terms of that.
Yeah, that's always very worrying, actually, when you have to recalibrate your plans. Now, great answers. I've got a question from Joey, who's kindly put it both in the chat and the Q&A because he knows I can't multitask, and he's right. And the question says, particularly for Elin and Eira, it seems as though you are using creative methods almost as a kind of icebreaker or a way into questions. Will you also be analysing these visualizations as a kind of art in artistic terms?
So yes, I have done some, what I would say, basic analysis, especially of the sort of map example I provided. I think you're right that it's sort of, in general, I get more data from the discussion that that follows, but that's probably an element of sort of lack of confidence and lack of experience. I don't want to jump to conclusions. I don't as to what things mean without then asking for the participant to explain as well. But I have done some analysis of sort of the layout, which aspects of the drawing is more prominent, where sometimes clusters of factors happen and some areas are left more blank, that sort of thing. And sometimes individuals have started adding little drawings, little hearts, little stars to things that, you know, I didn't lead them on, and then you can start drawing connections between some of what they're saying and those. But I actually tried to do quite a lot of reading about how to analyze it artistically and found very little guidance out there. And I think that's probably where then a bit of my lack of experience and lack of confidence comes from. I don't want to do something that then would be questioned, and I couldn't sort of justify how I'd done that, apart from saying, well, this is my interpretation of it. But if you've got any guidance around that, then I definitely take it. Elin, I don't know about you, whether...
Yeah, I just agree with you there. I analysed them? My answer is probably no, actually. So I did use them as more of an icebreaker technique. One, because that's how I structured the whole focus group, and two, as Eira said, I just felt I was lacking confidence in actually being able to analyse the visual data, and actually trying to look for guidance on how to analyse visual data is actually quite difficult, because everyone has their particular way and justifies that, but there seems to be no general consensus on how actually we go about that. I think a lot of people have been kind of using thematic analysis, qualitative thematic analysis, and kind of trying to see if, you know, that would fit into it. But I've been using them more so as, I guess, elicitation tools, and I guess aide-memoire also in terms of students being able to remember, or, you know, what they're actually trying to articulate. Yeah, I'm struggling for guidance as well, so any feedback would be great on that. I know the nursing journal's actually very good in terms of creative methods, so I'd always suggest looking at nursing journals. I've had a lot of inspiration actually from looking at different fields. So yeah, definitely nursing journals.
I just, to add as well, I wonder if there are different expectations between sciences, and I don't know whether it's sort of a hangover of both of us coming out of the SSRM masters, and where there's such, such a big emphasis put on kind of your methods, including your which analysis techniques you're using and justifying those, and therefore if there's no framework there, finding it hard to kind of find justification for doing that. I think certainly some of what my participants have produced lend themselves to being analysed artistically, but how to do that is the question.
Okay, so I think, sorry, carry on.
No, I just wanted to, as a comment to that, I was thinking of Elin's example of using emojis, and I think that the emojis can be quite an interesting example of how people interpret visual, because an emoji doesn't mean the same for everybody. And having studied Japanese before, and emojis do come from Japan. So you have all these emojis that in Japanese culture have certain meanings, and people use them completely different in Europe, which for me was quite of a shock, because the first time I saw them, I was explained what they meant in a Japanese context, and now people use them completely different. So I can see how the intention with which people use visual cues can be completely misunderstood by the person reading those.
Okay, that is really excellent. I've got a few questions myself, but Rachel has brilliantly come in with another question. So we all owe her a cup of tea, I think, at the very least. So thanks for your interesting answers. A broad question for any of this. Oh, hang on. Sorry, no, is it the same? Do you discuss? Oh, no, hold on, it's the same one. Thank you for yeah. A broad question for any of the speakers. How have you found the process of clarifying your methodological approaches in order to present it in the methodology chapter or section or in your written research? Do you discuss developments or changes? How are you finding this experience? That's a good question. Who wants to have a crack at that?
Well, I think in my case, it's pretty much what I've explained in my presentation today. I'm definitely adding that into my methodology section. I think it's important to acknowledge that there are differences, even if there's still much debate in the literature. Like I said, you have to see, you have to make it clear that you understand the implications of your methodological choices, and moving on from face-to-face interviews to online obviously means that certain things have changed, and I will also have to acknowledge how it has facilitated my research, which I think it's important to note.
Excellent. Who would like to go next?
I think one thing that my supervisors have advised me to do, Claudia in Lawpole and Hannah in Emlang, is to kind of create the sense of a journey through the methods chapter, because me personally, I've experienced quite a few changes. It began life as a comparative between Germany and the UK, and for a lot of reasons the UK side didn't work out, and then the pandemic hit, so then further fieldwork and everything had to be cancelled. So for me, I want to give the sense that the thesis has evolved through all these changes, and then hopefully be able to justify the changes that I've made subsequently after all these challenges.
Elena or Ira?
Yeah, I would agree with Kat there, actually. I think methodology chapter is like a journey and should be written as such, especially in the time of COVID, where everything is constantly changing. And I have to be honest, I'm trying to write a methods chapter now, but finding it nearly impossible, because my research plan is changing week after week, because I'm not being able to finish our fieldwork. So at the moment, I'm finding it one of the most difficult chapters to write because of these changes. And that's obviously coming from actually an MSc where we look specifically at methods. So that's been quite interesting. But I think something crucial for me in my methodology chapter will be to discuss research flexibility and how I've had to be constantly flexible in changing, well, in changing actually who's the participants in the actual research, as well as those methods as we've continued through the pandemic. Yeah.
Ira, yeah.
It's quite interesting hearing Kat and Elin's and Elena's answers there, actually, because yeah, I'm the same. I'm sort of grappling with this at the moment, and I feel like my methodological sort of vision has been turned on its head. Like my initial project was based on pupil voice, essentially, and how that had been left out of the debate. And I'm not going to have any pupil voice in my PhD anymore because I just can't access them. So I'm interested in what the others were saying, because I don't know to what extent I kind of express things like that, or do I just write a methods section that implies that, you know, to an extent, apart from a move online maybe and some small changes, this is what I set out to do, because I can't outline everything that I would have done and haven't been able to, sort of thing. So I agree that I want to express this journey, but I don't quite know how to do that at the moment. I don't know if Kat or Elena or Elin has any sort of...
Well, if anything, I learned from the SSRM is about the power of the appendix and how you can add a reflective account of your journey as well. So if you don't feel comfortable expressing all the mishaps in the methodology, because it just seems like you're going on and on and on about the things that you had to change. Obviously, you want the methodology to be a clear statement of what you're doing in this, or what you've done to get those that data. So yeah, I would personally, I would write a reflective account of how difficult it's been for all those reasons.
That's a good idea. That's a really good point. And actually you summed up far better than I did. Yeah, the problem there, the fact that you want your methods to explain.
Yeah, you want it to be clear.
And not the data that wasn't there. Thank you.
Okay, now I think I might be able to ask a couple of questions myself because I'm not seeing any others, but somebody will please continue sending in questions. Elena, I just wanted a couple of things. One was an obvious point. When you are doing an online interview, I assume that you get the agreement of the interviewee before recording them, although it is obvious with Zoom because you have to press that button. But you also mentioned how it's pretty much as good, but maybe not quite as good as face-to-face. So in your methods, you're clearly going to have to show how you sought to mitigate the perceived downside of interviews and really have to elaborate on that, because the obvious thing is when you do an interview with somebody and then they'll talk about something and then they'll say, oh, he's in the next office, or she's just down the corridor, and then you knock the door and then you see where they work and you'll see things on their board and you'll see things that you don't realize. So you may have to work out, was there any way, maybe you could say that you got to speak to the person face to face in an actual conference you attended, start to think about mitigating factors. And I don't know whether what you're going to put as a mitigating factor. And then Kat, in terms of your research question, I like your research question, but it's quite a catch-all research question as it currently stands. And I'm wondering how you can potentially narrow it down. And I'm thinking to myself, it looks to me as though you're really looking not at the I may be wrong, not at the rank and file, but more at the opinion formers within these right-wing groups. Now, if that is the case, then that might, these would be people who are slightly more informed than the average voter that goes along and supports it. Now, I don't know whether you are trying to break it down in those terms. And I'm also wondering whether you've given consideration to the kind of case that you're studying, because it strikes me that Germany's got a whole history right? When you get a far-right movement in Germany, it's not the same as having a far-right movement almost anywhere else in the world. So is Germany in some ways a deviant case, you know? And if it is a deviant case, that's fine. But the lessons you learn from Germany as a deviant case may be different from the lessons you learn from other countries with far-right parties. Now, I don't know whether that is true. And then lastly, for Elin and Eira, I would just say that I agree with Joey's point, actually. I think there could be something in that artistic evaluation, because in effect, when you're writing a methodology chapter, you've got to map the methods onto your research question. So in other words, how is this methodology enabling me to answer the research question? So are the creative methods enabling you to get in to the minds of students in a way that they wouldn't otherwise be, you wouldn't otherwise be able to? And if so, what does that bring to bear, and what do you then do with the data that you've acquired? So I suppose it's the rationale for saying, how do those methods enable me to answer my research question? And so these are sort of partly comments, partly questions, but you can give an answer, or you can say, I'll tell you another day. I'll leave it up to you.
Thank you, Gordon. Yes, you're quite right that there are certain things, as I conduct interviews online, I realize, for example, the importance of the voting, perhaps the first 5 to 10 minutes of the interview, to building that rapport with the person, and not really talking about, not jumping straight onto the interview, which you would do in person anyway. But there is a certain, I know, you realize that it's a bit of a slower process. So you need to have that, and also perhaps invite that person to, I don't know, make themselves a cup of tea before we start, that sort of thing. So emailing and the way, learning to write emails in a warm way, not too straight to the point, can be really important too.
Thanks for your comments. I think, yeah, my research questions have kind of undergone continual development, really, since the different structural changes that the projects had to undergo. I've kind of deliberately kept them quite broad, because in some ways that's a bit of a logistical thing. I need to see what sort of evidence is out there, and, you know, how I can recoup some of my losses through, you know, analysing documentary sources. You know, what can I access, what information's out there. It's certainly always in development. And also the opinion formers as such, it's really interesting you say that, because I only managed to interview one MP, as it were, and the rest of my interviewees were party members. And actually a lot of them had been half of them had been politically interested before joining the party, and half of them had no political experience at all. So the party has been really shrewd in engaging these two sides of the electorate, people who are politically active already and those who weren't interested before. So there's a nice balance in the discussion between, you know, people who know a lot about politics and other people who didn't until 2013 when they joined the party. And I wouldn't say Germany is a deviant case as such. Since the end of the war, Second World War, there's kind of been a long and unbroken history of right-wing movements in Germany. And I think that the kind of, I say, unique thing about this case is that a far right or a populist radical right party has managed to garner so much popular support, and what that means for Germany, you know, how successful are they going to be in the future? I mean, their approval ratings plummeted during the pandemic. Angela Merkel had 88% approval rating for her handling of the crisis. So I think it's part of a process, and I'm interested to see where it goes now that the party are facing observation by the security services. That's kind of like, I guess in the UK, parties get prescribed by the Home Office and they get banned. But in Germany, they get monitored and then a decision is made. So the party's currently legal, but it could be classed as illegal depending on the outcome of the investigation. So whether they're going to be a successful example of a far-right party who's breached the mainstream, I think it's too soon to tell.
Shall I just?
Yep.
So I just wanted to say that I completely agree with you. I think that's why we tried to reinforce in our presentation that, you know, these aren't methods that you can just pick up and use in another project. They are very much linked to what we're trying to find out and the situations we're working in. But I also think there is another dimension to the methods you choose, in not just how they help you answer your question, but how they put your participants at ease, how they help them answer your questions, you know, so you're not threatening or putting them under pressure, that sort of thing. And I do feel like sometimes, I guess, to reflect what Joey said, these are sort of a bit icebreaker activities maybe that get people's thoughts flowing. And then in my case, there was dimension that I was aware I was taking up, was asking for time from students who were already very busy. And I wanted to design my focus group in a way that also helped them with the role that they were playing within the project that I was researching. So I did my focus groups just after their initial training and before they were expected to put together a presentation on their language journeys. So I thought, well, what sort of activity can we do that helps them form a picture of that helps me answer my question, but also gives them sort of something to take away that they can use in their own work. So I think there are those two dimensions. So I think I do get that we have to be able to justify how it helps us, but I think there's also the dimension of whether these are the right things for our participants. And that's particularly relevant when you're talking about children, but that wasn't the case for me this time, but yeah.
I'll just very briefly add a comment there. You know, having done different projects with the university over the years, I've worked a lot with school children, and what tends to happen is they're very quiet and they're very shy, and just asking a question, you don't get a lot back. And so for me, the importance of using creative methods in my particular context at the time was to think, as Eira said, you know, how can I make these, you know, how do I ensure that these students feel at ease to actually say something? And, you know, some of the topics we were discussing was, you know, in terms of migration, and some of the topics are quite difficult to discuss. And sometimes talking about something that you've actually, you know, drawn is easier than just saying how you feel in terms of words, if that makes sense. And obviously I was hosting, well, so was Eira, focus groups. You know, groupthink can be a problem in focus groups as well. And so for me, those activities were very important to be separate activities. So the data then came really from those the different views. But timeline interviewing, interestingly, you know, I think Eira mentioned this herself, some students actually were quite reluctant to draw because they were thinking, oh, it's not perfect, I can't draw. So it'd be interesting if I do this again, I think I would just concentrate a bit more on the emojis, because there's no need to draw either, you just need to circle. But again, it'd be interesting to see how those methods would work with older students and younger students. It'd be very interesting. So we'll see if I'll be able to use these methods in the PhD now.
Okay, I think we're going to have to wrap it up because I see a number of people have said thank you very, very much to all the speakers, and they've actually they've got to go into another meeting. And Rachel's also saying well done to everyone. I would also just refer Eira and Elin to that rubbishy website of mine, which is called on NGOs, because I do a lot on focus groups and how they're used. And then, I mean, you could draw a parallel between some of the methods used by NGOs to elicit information from African and other populations where they are illiterate, you know, and cannot write. So they use diagrams, all kinds of, I mean, there's loads of stuff on that website. But I would actually just like to reiterate that this was a really high quality presentations, and a number of people have thanked us. So I'm going to stop at that point. You know, there's a survey to fill in. I've already told you about subsequent meetings. I just want to thank all of the speakers, and perhaps stop the recording and maybe ask Elena if she's willing to stay on, because we often do a little tweet at the end. Okay, so thanks very much to everybody, and thanks to all the audience as well. Hugely appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.